Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of
Tracing Text
with Anton
and Sylvia.
coming to you live from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee. And today, where are we, Sylvia?
We're at the library and we are going to record episode number 15. Can you believe that?
It's hard to believe that we made it to 15 episodes of Tracing Text. All the students are gone, so there's absolutely no noise here, and we're going to be able to record, I could call it, I guess, a landmark episode. We made it to number 15.
Exactly. And today it's going to be focusing on some topic that you are interested in. Tell us your author and specifically what work we will be talking about today.
We're going to be talking about an author that you don't get to hear very much about usually, and particularly not about this work that we're going to be talking about today. It's a novel called El Primer Loco, or The First Madman, by the Galician Spanish author Rosalía de Castro.
Wonderful. You've brought in a woman to your repertoire.
That's true. Is that the first woman? Is that the first woman?
And I've had a man because we had the Argentinian Borges.
That's
so
true.
Now it's your turn.
Well, I'm very glad to bring a woman to Tracing Texts because that's true. It's surprising to think that out of these 15 episodes, I may have chosen about 7 or 8, and they were always men. Well, it's going to be Rosalía de Castro. I'm really interested in the work of Rosalía de Castro, and one of the reasons why I'm bringing her is a good friend of mine who teaches at a university in the United States asked me not long ago to participate via Skype in one of his classes talking precisely about Rosalía de Castro, not necessarily this work, but, I decided to reread this novel that I hadn't read in many years, and I thought it would be a good topic for Tracing Texts.
That's wonderful. So tell us a little bit about the background with respect to her writing itself.
Rosalía is really one of the most important names in Galician literature. Galicia is in the northwest of Spain. That's actually where I was born. And she is well known particularly due to 2 collections of poems that she wrote in the 19th century. One of them is Cantares Gallegos, something like Galician songs from 1863. And the other one is Follas Novas, meaning new leaves, which was written in 1869 and 1870 just about, but it wouldn't be published until about 10 years later in 1880. These books are extremely important in Galician literature because, maybe our listeners out there don't know that Galician literature was extremely popular in the Middle Ages because of all the troubadours that came from all over the rest of Europe. And back in those days, the Galician language was actually known as Galician Portuguese because it was spoken in the north and all the way to the south in what is now Portugal. And it was a very important literary language in those days, 12th, 13th centuries just about. But for many centuries, the Galician language did not have many literary expressions until the 19th century. And in the 19th century comes this era known as the Resurgimento or Renaissance of the literature written in Galician, and Rosalía de Castro is one of the most important figures.
Does that have to do with the Romantic movement in general, where this nationalist desire to collect all of the local legends and literature? So in this case, Galician literature for this area of the world.
Yes, and it all goes back to German Romanticism that placed so much importance on the personal expression of the writers. The ego becomes really important now. And of course, the idea of nation and the idea of nationality, and also the idea of the folkloric traditions being written down and so they wouldn't be forgotten. Yeah, I think you know quite a bit about that because
that's one of my favorite topics.
You probably could talk about that a lot better than I can.
Yeah.
But that all goes back to that idea of Romanticism and Rosalía, and a lot of these early nationalists in Galicia were really influenced by these, I think, highly idealistic ideas coming from the German Romantics.
Right. So what were some of the themes that she treats in her literature?
I think those two collections of poetry that she wrote in Galician, Cantares Gallegos and Follas Novas, are very interesting, not just because they were written in Galician, that's one of the reasons, but if you think about the content, it's also a very interesting couple of collections of poems. You will, if you read those two books, which are fairly easy to find, and I'm not sure if they're translated into English or not, but at least they have been translated into Spanish. And they treat themes such as immigration, the sadness and grief of the poet reflected on the landscape.
So romantic.
Very romantic in that respect. Also the folk traditions of Galicia, which inform a lot of her poetry, the meters, of the poetry, but also the themes of the poetry. But even if these two collections of poetry are deeply influenced by Romanticism, they also reflect, or attempt to reflect, the situation of the peasants at the time in Galicia, and also the situations of women at the time in Galicia. She was a woman writer, and she was well aware of this. So is Rosalía de Castro a feminist? It's hard to tell, again, because we're talking about the 19th century. I usually like to think of it as proto-feminism, which doesn't necessarily mean is exactly the kind of feminism we have these days.
We can't use our own perspective to judge something that was written so long ago.
But definitely that's important. The idea of woman is important.
And she has class consciousness because she's so concerned with the status of peasants.
That's true, and that's interesting too, because of when we deal with her biography, we will see that she went through some hardships.
Right.
But she also had much more education than the average woman would have had in those days in Galicia.
Right. So did she write in Galician or in Spanish?
Well, she actually wrote in both.
Okay.
And I think this romanticism is what informed her writing in Galician. More than anything, I would say that more than the nationalism, it is this romantic idea of the roots of the writer, the nationality of the writer, that leads her to write in Galician to try and preserve a language that had been spoken all those centuries, but that had not been written very much.
Right.
But she also wrote in Spanish because she lived in Madrid part of her life, and also because writing in Spanish was the way to make money at writing.
Right.
Not that she ever really made a lot of money at writing, but it was the way to enter the world of literature at the time and still today.
It's like if you're here in the States, you would write in English because your marketability is important. So basically, from a very practical point of view.
And we've talked about that with some of the other writers.
With Rivera Garza and with Luiselli. So yes, that makes... Well, Rivera Garza writes in Spanish, but Luiselli, her going back and forth between English and Spanish.
Now, the works that she wrote in Spanish are not as popular or have not been as recognized by the critics for many reasons. For example, she wrote a collection of poems entitled En las orillas del Sar, by the banks of the river Sar, which is a river in Galicia, around the part of the country where she was born. And she also wrote 5 novels. Now, these are mostly forgotten by Galician critics, perhaps because they're written in Spanish and not in Galician.
Yeah.
That's one of the problems with nationalism, that sometimes, nationalist critics tend to view language as a sign of identity instead of what it really is.
The context, the content, rather.
The content, and also the fact that, as I think we've said before, or at least I've said before here on Tracing Texts, I see language as a technology for communication.
Right.
So obviously, if she wrote in Spanish, she would have a much wider audience than if she wrote in Galician. But a lot of the critics concentrate more on her Galician works for linguistic reasons, for nationalistic, I would even say, reasons. And then Hispanists usually don't give her the importance that she really had, or at least the importance of similar women writers of the time, such as Emilia Pardo Bazán, who wrote only in Spanish.
Right. Now with Emilia Pardo Bazán, because of course she's very well known and everybody reads her if you study Hispanic literature of any, if you study that, do you think that it was her relationship with Benito Pérez Galdós that made her more prominent, or did Rosalía not have those ties? I mean, what makes Emilia Pardo Bazán more prominent or more studied than Rosalía de Castro?
Well, she was a lot more prolific,
Okay.
to begin with. Of course, the connections that you're talking about would be important, but, Rosalía had important connections as
Yeah.
well. Her husband was,
Right.
an important intellectual. But, in many ways, Pardo Bazán wrote about a lot more different topics. She only wrote in Spanish, and of course, the quality of her writing is, beyond the shadow of a doubt.
Right.
One of the most important in the late 19th
Right.
century in Spain. So it is difficult to compare the two
The two.
because they really don't have as much in common as you might think.
So there's not a lot of points of comparison. They just happen to be from the same time period, and they both happen to be Galician.
And there are certain things, that you, I guess, could compare. But whereas Pardo Bazán is part of the literary canon in Spanish, Rosalía de Castro, not so much. From the point of view of the Spanish language, if you switch to the Galician
Right.
language and you take the standpoint of Galician, Gallego,
Then she does.
then she is revered as one of the, really a founding figure in Galician literature. In fact, the Day of Galician Letters is a Día de las Letras Galegas that is celebrated in May, the 17th of May. In fact, not too long ago this year. It's celebrated every year, and it's always devoted to a writer that is not among us anymore. She was the first one that back in, even already or still during Franco's times, she was, I guess, the Day of Galician Letters, the very first time, she was the writer that was honored. So, from the point of view of Galician literature, she is extremely important, very much recognized. Not so much, she's more of I wouldn't say a footnote, but a minor figure within the history of Spanish literature.
Well, I guess we can move on then and talk about her novels. You said she has 5. Can you tell us a little bit about each one?
She wrote 5 novels, yes, and all of them, with the exception of perhaps one, are very forgotten by literary critics. You can look on the MLA database and you will not find a lot of articles about her novels. You'll find several about her poetry, and some about, from the point of view of feminism, for example, but you will not find a lot of articles about her novels. And she wrote 5. The first one in 1859 was entitled La hija del mar, the daughter of the sea. And it is remembered for its preface. The preface, sometimes critics mention the preface more than the actual novel, because in it she affirms her personality as a woman writer. The idea that women also had the right to express themselves in writing, to be writers. And the novel is set on the Galician coast and is very much influenced by the Bronte sisters, particularly Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Obviously, she had been reading in translation the novels, at least Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. After that, a couple of years later, in 1861, she wrote the novel Flavio, which is a very romantic novel in tone, and it's also about the theme of unrequited love, very typical, again, of the Romantic period. The third one, from 1867, El Caballero de las Botas Azules, or the Gentleman of the Blue Boots.
Makes me think of the poster boots.
Antonio Banderas, right?
I know. I'm sorry.
Well, this is her most celebrated novel by
Okay.
far, at least by the critics. It's not like you stand in the middle of Madrid and you say the title of this novel, and everyone is like, yeah, I know it. But it is a well-known novel by her, by far the most celebrated that she wrote. And it's quite innovative due to the fantastic undertones of
Okay.
some of its parts.
Okay.
We don't have really the time to go into it, but it is a novel that I highly recommend because it's a fun read, and it's also quite innovative in some parts. It also gives you a very interesting picture of the Madrid literary landscape
Or
at the
the
time.
scene, what it was like. Okay.
Then comes Ruinas from 1866, and this one is about three marginal characters that have to deal with their problems and shortcomings precisely because they're marginal characters.
Okay.
And the novel kind of goes back and forth between the stories of each one of them. So in that way, it's not necessarily innovative, but it's a different type of structure. So it's an interesting novel as well. By the way, some of these, La hija del mar and this one, Ruinas or Ruins, you can find that novel, for example, for free in Spanish on Kindle.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
You'd be able to read it that way. Same thing with El Primer Loco. And precisely El Primer Loco from 1881, that's her fifth novel and her last. And it is, in many ways, a return to purely romantic themes. Though, as we will see, or I hope to show or to discuss during this episode of Tracing Texts, it is really not as romantic, not as idealistic, not as irrational as one might think.
So do you think she's moving into more naturalist tendencies or realist or just different?
Not necessarily, because there's a lot of romanticism, particularly in one of the characters, but there's another character that sort of counterbalances this tendency. So I think, that's an important thing to think about. She's trying to move into something else.
Right,
but she hasn't really quite gotten there yet.
Right.
So those are the five novels that she wrote. Most of them, as I say, you can find on Kindle for free, to download for free in Spanish. They have not been translated into English, but any of our listeners that might know Spanish wouldn't have a problem finding them and
you never know, some of them who our listeners might be, if they are scholars as well, may translate some of these novels.
That would be good. That's a tough a tough job, but
yes.
But it would be nice to have them in English, at least some of them. You're listening to
Tracing Texts
with Anton
and Sylvia.
And today we're talking about Rosalía de Castro, her life, her career, and also one of her novels, the last one she wrote, The First Madman, or El Primer Loco, in Spanish.
Now, you've given us kind of the literary landscape, her major works. So tell us now a little bit about her life. What was her life like, her upbringing? What led her to be a writer?
Her life wasn't enjoyable, really, part of the time at least. She had lots of problems. She didn't have an incredibly happy life. But she had an interesting life in many ways. She was born in Santiago de Compostela, that's where the big cathedral is, the very end of St. James's Way, El Camino de Santiago, and she was born in 1837 there. But she was born to an unmarried woman.
That would have been very difficult in that time period.
Very difficult, particularly since some of her biographers, and there have been many, because she is so important within Galician literature, some of them say that her father may have been a clergyman.
Oh, even worse. Even worse.
In fact, we don't really know much, if anything, about the father. He would not show up again throughout the rest of her life. But her aunt took care of her in her first few years until her mother decided or was able to come back into her life. And from then on, she lived with her mom for a long time. From 1850 on, when she was around 13 or so, she lives in Santiago with her mom, receiving, and I mentioned this before, a much better education than what was common for women at the time.
Do you know why that was the case? Was her mother interested in her having a better education, or were there like, kind of these lucky factors that allowed her to just have a better education?
Well, despite the fact that she was born to an unmarried woman, this woman belonged to a fairly important family.
Okay, so in terms of social class, she was, somewhat well off.
Yes, I mean, not rich by any means, but she had the chance to have access to education in a way that many women and even men at the time didn't really have such a chance. So, of course, that will be important in her life, but even more important than that is the fact that 6 years later, in 1856, she and her mother moved to Madrid, to the capital of Spain, for reasons that are unknown to me. I'm not sure why that happened. In the biographies that I have consulted, it's never very clear why. But while in Madrid, she began to write, and also very importantly, she married the Galician nationalist Manuel Murguia, who was one of the most active intellectuals at the time and one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of Galician nationalism in the 19th century. Now, I'm not going to say that their relationship was easy, because throughout the years they had lots of problems. But at least Murguia supported Rosalia's literary endeavors.
Which is pretty progressive at the time.
He was a writer himself, and he was not opposed to the idea of women writing, and he was not opposed to the idea of his own wife writing. And in fact, these days, Rosalía, at least in Galicia, is better remembered than Manuel Murguia, even though Manuel Murguia is an important figure as well, from the point of view of politics and essay and nationalistic essays and that sort of thing. One thing is to be in favor of women writing. Another thing is to be in favor of your own wife writing at the time.
When it comes down to the realities, right?
When things are, abstract,
it's easy to.
It's always a lot easier to stand behind those ideas. But when it's something that affects you personally, it's not so easy. And he actually was supportive, and apparently he was the one that led her to publish that collection of poems called Cantares Gallegos that we mentioned before, the Galician songs, which, by the way, was published in Vigo, in my hometown,
Very cool.
in the 1860s. Now, another problem they had is that they moved around quite a bit because of Murguia's profession. He was some sort of a diplomat, so he was moving around quite a bit. And they eventually settled in Galicia, where Rosalía would die in the small town of Padrón, which is still there and can be visited. In 1885 is when she died, when she was only 48.
Oh, she was very young.
She was very young.
I guess she was ill?
Yes, she suffered from several medical conditions throughout her life. She was a woman of a very melancholic nature. She felt a lot of grief throughout her life, and all of this really affected her deeply. If you read some of her biographies, you will see that some of the biographers even say that this I guess I wouldn't say instability, but this melancholic nature that she had, and the difficulties that she went through as a writer, and as a woman living at that time, and the unhappiness that she sometimes felt in her marriage caused her to want to commit suicide several times. But that's not the reason why she died. She apparently never really
attempted or did it. Yeah.
So
she was just ill.
She was, but she lived an interesting life in that she was able to write her books. She was able to publish all of these works, and she died obviously not knowing that she was going to be such a revered figure in Galicia. All these all this time later. But, you know, she was able to contribute to the Renaissance, to rebirth of Galician literature with those, particularly with those two collections of poems. But she also wrote down some folk tales or some stories that were influenced by Galician folk tales written in Galician. Not a whole collection of them, but you know, some in different newspapers and magazines and stuff like that. And she was a part of the literary scene in Galicia at the time, whatever the scene looked like, or however big it was. She was one of the most important figures. It still did not help her necessarily on a personal level, because she still felt so unhappy, and she felt this saudade.
Right.
You know,
so in a way, she
time.
probably was suffering from depression or something like that, which nowadays, you know, that may have been her diagnosis.
It's not. It's not that strange, really, as you say. But in those days,
it was not.
It wasn't easily diagnosed, and it wasn't easily treatable.
Right.
Not that it is now, but but it wasn't really possible back then.
Right. Well, today you're talking about one of her novels, El Primer Loco from 1881, or The First Madman. Tell us about that novel now.
Well, I have it right here in my hand. There's different ways in which you can find the novel. I've mentioned that it's available on Kindle for free. You can always also find one of these fairly cheap editions that only have the text with no notes or anything.
Right.
And then you can buy online fairly cheaply. It's also been, of course, included in one of the volumes of her complete works. Complete works have been published, both her complete works in Gallego and in Spanish. So there's different ways in which you can find it, and I urge you to do so, because it's really a very interesting novel. Otherwise, I wouldn't have brought it to this episode of Tracing Texts. But I've read this novel a couple of times, and the second time I read it, I liked it even better than the first time around. It is her last novel. It's shorter than her previous ones, and many of the critics, not that there are too many critics that have written about it, but they have noted a return to purely romantic themes. But as I said before, that irrational romantic attitude that is embodied in the character of Luis is somehow counterbalanced by the more rational approach to things that the character of Pedro has.
Okay, so those are the two main characters?
I wouldn't say the main, but they are definitely two important characters. Luis is by far the main character, and Pedro is sort of his interlocutor, because they're talking, and Luis will tell the story to Pedro, and that's how we hear about the story. Unfortunately, the novel has been overlooked by critics. Not too many articles have been written about it. But I like an article, and I can't remember the title of it right now. I didn't write it down in my notes, but it was written by Alba del Pozo, a scholar named Alba del Pozo. And she talks, and I think she does a very good job in talking about madness in the novel from a medical perspective, because the idea of madness and the necessity, perhaps, that society has of getting rid of those elements of madness from society and making them become recluse in a kind of a hospital or institution is one of the important ideas that is explored in this novel by Rosalía de Castro.
Right. That's interesting, because it's kind of the time period that if we look at theorists or critics like Foucault, and they start talking about the medicalization of something like madness. And in that sense, she's really, observant of what's going on in society, not just the literary aspects, but the social aspects that are implied.
And she's doing something very interesting in this novel as a result.
Right.
As we will see if we talk a little bit about its plot. This really is a doomed love story. You know from the beginning pretty much that the love story has not really come to fruition.
Right.
towards the end of the novel. You know this pretty much from the beginning. It's the love story of Luis and Bernice, or Berenice. I suppose that would be the pronunciation in Spanish. I'll use Bernice as we discuss. I'll use this pronunciation of this name. A woman whom Luis describes in a very idealized way. So she sees her, and from that moment, he just completely idealizes her. And this is counterbalanced by Pedro, who does not have as good an opinion of Bernice as Luis does, because he also happens to know this woman.
Right.
This happens in a small town in Galicia, and of course, Pedro knows who Luis is talking about from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So we get both
sides of the story, yeah.
Exactly, or at least two sides of the story.
We know a little bit more of her character in that way.
Yes, because it is presented by Luis in a way, and then it is counterbalanced by what Pedro thinks about her. Now, at the very beginning of their love story, Bernice seems to be interested by all the attention that she's getting from Luis, but in time she's going to grow tired of him, and she's going to leave him.
Oh.
In order to marry, look at this, a rich man from New York City.
Oh, so she's really more interested in material wealth, perhaps.
Yes, not that Luis would not be able to
support her,
but perhaps not in the way that this New Yorker could.
Right.
We don't know the name of the New Yorker, by the way. He's just referred to as El Neoyorquino.
That's hilarious.
Or something like that.
A generic New Yorker.
And actually, the description of him is completely negative.
Oh, okay.
As you can imagine, especially when Luis is talking about him. From this moment, when he is left by Bernice, who marries this American, Luis will become obsessed with Bernice and with his memory of Bernice. And upon his encounter with another young woman, there's another young woman that he meets. And upon his encounter with her, her name is Esmeralda, she falls in love with him, and he will treat her just as badly, just as heartlessly as Bernice treated him. So what is he going to do? He's going to abandon Esmeralda as well. And perhaps as a result of this, Esmeralda will die. Maybe because she killed herself. But this is never clear
in the novel.
It could be, but if you read it carefully, you will not really find a specific mention of that.
Okay, so it's just speculation that that's a possibility.
Maybe she died of grief. Maybe she killed herself. In any case, she leaves this world following this rejection by Luis.
What happens once she dies?
Well, Luis does not hear of Esmeralda's death right away, because for a while, for about a month or so, he has been avoiding her after telling her in no uncertain terms that their relationship was over. There's this part of the novel where they meet, and she thinks that they're meeting in order to be together and just discuss the future, and he just says to her, "No, I don't want you anymore," and she just becomes completely, she doesn't know what to do.
Right.
And she throws herself at his feet, really
kind of
in a very dramatic sort of way. But he is inflexible, and he says, "No, I don't want you in my life. I don't want to be with you." Of course, he is acting in many ways because of the fact that he is not in love with this girl, with this woman, because of the fact that he had been desperately in love with Bernice before. Now, the interesting thing, and I think you will like this, because I know you like, the supernatural and ghosts and all of that. And in a way, Bernice could be seen as the femme fatale that you're so interested in as well.
That's true, very true.
And, we could go into that, but I've chosen not to go into that because, we don't want to make the episode too long. But I think you'll be interested in this. Even before Luis knows that Esmeralda is now dead, even before he hears of this, Esmeralda appears in front of him in the form of a ghost. and he notices, and this is important, that there's something wrong, something strange, something different about her. Of course, she has appeared as a ghost, but he notices that she has terrible teeth.
Isn't that, I mean, I don't know, but in folklore, if you dream of someone with bad teeth, that there's death or something like that to that effect. I mean, that's what I thought.
That appears, in several folk tales.
Right.
So yes, definitely. But it is also clear that Rosalía had been reading Edgar Allan Poe's Bernice.
How very clever.
Which is a short story that Edgar Allan Poe wrote, in which a man is so obsessed with the character of Bernice that after the death of Bernice, or I guess he kills Bernice and then collects all her teeth, puts them inside of a wooden box.
It's very interesting because one of Luis Celi's novels is all about the teeth of famous people.
And
we'll have to go back to that.
I thought that as well. And really, I didn't choose this novel. I didn't choose it, Sylvia, because of that. I just happened to read it, and I thought this would be a good novel to talk about.
I like that connection.
But there are a lot of connections here.
It's fantastic.
Well, if you've read Edgar Allan Poe's Bernice, which is a great short story, just like most of the ones that Poe wrote, there is a clear connection there, and this is not me. Some of the few critics that have talked about this novel have seen this. It's fairly easy to see, really, with the name of the character, which is not a Spanish name or a typical Spanish name, and then this image of the ghost with really bad teeth. But this happens. This actually happens before Luis hears of the death of Esmeralda.
So it's almost like he has this premonition. The ghost functions as a premonition of him learning about her death.
Yeah, it's foreshadowing what is to come soon thereafter. And what happens is that Luis learns of her passing, of Esmeralda's death, and even gets to attend the burial, where he has the impression that Esmeralda is alive in her coffin and is talking to him. And this creates kind of like a chaotic situation because he mentions that and people are a little bit worried according to the way he tells it. Because, we also have to be careful. We cannot take at face value absolutely everything that he says. Because as you can see, little by little, Rosalía is showing that this obsession that Luis has with Bernice is slowly transforming into perhaps something more, perhaps into madness.
Right. There's also the fact that she's potentially alive in her coffin also is very much Poe-like because of the various
premature burial.
Yeah. So
Mr. Voldemort.
Exactly. So I can see some of those connections as well, and how all of this is leading to a path of madness.
You're listening to another episode of
Tracing Text
with Anton
and Sylvia.
And we're talking about El Primer Loco, or the First Madman. That is Luis, the character of this novel, the main character of this novel by Rosalía de Castro, a Spanish writer from the 19th century who wrote both in Spanish and in Galician. This is one of her lesser-known works, a novel that she wrote in Spanish in 1881, and it would be actually her last novel that she published about 5 or 6 years before her passing at age 48. We're live at the library here, no sounds at all, no students because the semester is over, and what would students be doing in a library when the semester is over?
Exactly, but here we are, fans of literature.
Now, the idea of madness here, Sylvia, is interesting because he is not really completely mad. He's not completely mad because Luis, had been able to understand at some point during this story, and he says so, that he has been treating Esmeralda really badly. So
it's guilt that is, provoking these, hallucinations or these ideas that, that Esmeralda is possibly alive in her coffin.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there has to be that sort of connection. Is he a madman? Is he crazy? Is he mad?
Depends on how you define.
It depends on how you define it, but there's a very crafty way in which Rosalia is hinting at the fact that he has been taken over by this obsession with Bernice. This makes him, I think, more than a true madman, what I would call a literary madman.
And what do you mean by a literary madman?
A literary madman is a madman that designs himself as a madman, more than a person that really is crazy. What I'm trying to say is that when you think of somebody who is mad in real life, outside in the real world, there are many people out there. I'm not discounting myself from that list, but there are many people out there that are mad, that have mental problems, and they, of course, become a nuisance in many cases. It's not a fun thing to be around, or a fun person to be around, right? A literary madman like Don Quixote, for example, or in this case Luis, is more of a madman by design.
There's some self-awareness in
That's
that.
right. It's almost, I'm not going to say like a mask that this person is, this character is wearing, but it's definitely, there's a certain self-awareness of this condition.
If you when you mention the fact that Rosalía de Castro is talking about madness in the sense of its medical, constructs, how it's constructed from a medical point of view. Isn't self-awareness, though, the same thing as if you had some sort of other disease? Let's say you had cancer and you go into remission. Well, you're not always you're not always ill or sick. Mm-hmm. The same thing could be the case with madness. So in a way, maybe she's exploring that idea that you go into moments of madness, but then you may come out of that and you have a period of lucidity.
True.
And there is that self-awareness of state of remission, but then maybe go back to that. And then maybe that's why, like a character like Luis or Don Quixote are able to reflect on their situation.
Yes, I think in this case, Rosalía de Castro is doing, actually what she is doing in this novel is a literary treatment of the idea of madness.
Right.
In that, many of the attitudes that the character of Luis has throughout the novel are the typical attitudes that you would attribute to the mad characters of Romanticism.
Right.
In that there's a certain dramatic element to the discourses of Luis in this novel that makes it clear that in his madness there's a lot of imitation of certain readings that he may have been doing.
So there's a performative aspect to madness.
In the case of a literary madman or madwoman, I have no doubt about that. In the case of Luis, for sure, because of the kind of speech that he uses, the kind of words, the kind of expressions, and this, I think, obsession with Bernice that he has created for himself. Because as soon as he sees Bernice, if you read the novel in the first few chapters, you'll see this. He completely idealizes this woman in a way that is incredibly exaggerated. So I think this is part of the problem with the character of Luis, in that he is always looking at the world and trying for the world to conform to his ideas instead of him trying to become compatible with the world out there. And this is where his madness comes from, I think. And that's why I call this madness more of a literary madness than, for lack of a better word, real madness. Because he is aware of this, he's aware of what he's doing, and he is in many ways imitating the romantic heroes of his possible readings, although he doesn't really mention that he has been reading any novels in particular. Which is
often the case, that they are also affected by their literary, like it's mentioned specifically that they're affected by their reading, their literary background affects their state of mind. Very interesting.
Now, something that's very interesting that I think you would like to hear about has to do with the structure of the novel. I think Rosalía does a good job here in the way she structures this novel. This novel could be narrated in many different ways, but she chooses to make it a conversation between Luis and his friend Pedro. Why is this important? Well, they're both taking a stroll in the woods near a convent, in a little town called Concho in Galicia, northwest of Spain. And Luis is telling Pedro this story, and as he tells the story to Pedro, Pedro gets a chance to interrupt several times, to make comments, to ask questions. We have access to Pedro's thoughts. And I mentioned that before already when we talked about the description that Luis has of Bernice that's incredibly idealistic. Then we get the thoughts of Pedro. He doesn't say this to Luis, but he's thinking. How can he be thinking this about this woman who is a very conceited woman, really? She is not really in love with him because she's only in love with herself, something like that. So you get the thoughts of Pedro, which counterbalance the idealism of Luis. So on the one hand, you could say that Luis is the idealistic, romantic character. Pedro is the more rational, the more materialistic character of the two.
Very interesting. So how does this story then end? Like what happens once Esmeralda dies?
It ends with a bang, and it ends with irony as well.
Okay.
When Luis finishes telling the story to Pedro, who appears unexpectedly in the woods from behind a tree all of a sudden?
I don't know.
Any guesses?
I don't know.
Could it be Esmeralda? No, because
she's dead. So could it be Bernice?
It's Bernice.
Well, I thought she went to New York.
You thought she went to New York, and we all thought she went to New York, and she did go to New York. But she appears out of the blue.
Is that a supernatural element, or is this like
the
real
in this
deal?
Case, no supernatural.
Okay.
She appears unexpectedly in the woods with her American husband, with the New Yorker, because they have been visiting her hometown together many years later, several years later. It doesn't say how many years later. And supposedly she had forgotten all this story about Luis. But who does she find? Luis right there, who's just been telling Pedro the story.
So he was so unimportant to her that she has forgotten that she
Even though they spend, long afternoons and evenings and even nights together. We are told.
Right.
So she appears there with the New Yorker, we still don't know his name. And Luis, of course, recognizes her. He's really surprised. But this surprise turns into anger, and it turns into violence because he physically attacks Bernice's husband.
When in fact, the culprit is not the husband. It's Bernice who was shallow and not forthcoming in the relationship.
If we want to find a culprit in the matters of the heart, then I guess she would be more than...
But why the husband?
More than the New Yorker. But he attacks the husband, but nothing really happens because he is reduced by some servants of, this is still the 19th century, so these people have money and they have servants, and also by Pedro, who helps, a little bit here. This is how we can see, really, Sylvia, that Luis is a character who refuses to make himself compatible with reality. He wants the reality around him to conform to his wishes, to his views about reality, and not the other way around. And I think this is one of the important things. I think, honestly, and this is something that we could extrapolate from the book to the real world and to the 21st century and to you and to me and to everyone listening to this episode, when people do not conform to reality, when they don't make themselves compatible with reality, only a disaster, only something really negative can occur.
Right, expectations don't match.
Exactly. So if you have certain expectations and the reality gives you another set of real things in front of you, you need to change your expectations.
Right.
And Luis is a character who's not able to do this.
He's very inflexible. He's not able to, he's not able to change or to grow as a character in that sense. So he's going to end up with a lot of problems.
Now that final scene is a sort of coda, really, because you don't expect that this is going to happen, but it happens. They appear out of the blue. in this little fight or attempt to attack the husband on the part of Louise happens. But there's almost a sort of epilogue at the end of this story, because Louise is going to come into some money from an inheritance, and he's going to use a big chunk of that money to build a psychiatric hospital in Concho,
Right.
where the convent was.
Uh-huh.
Now, this psychiatric hospital still exists
Oh, how
to
very
this day,
interesting.
because Rosalía de Castro was actually using real information about a real hospital or asylum that was being built at the time, and that would be open a couple of years after the publication of this book. So if you are in Concho at any point
I'm
in
gonna
the
have
northwest of Spain, you could visit the psychiatric hospital, which it still is a psychiatric hospital, and I've never been there, but my mom has told me that it's incredibly beautiful because it had originally been a convent that was turned into a psychiatric hospital. Now, the irony here, as you may have guessed, if you were thinking about why is this novel called The First Madman, El Primer Loco.
Right.
Well, it's because at the end of the novel, after this asylum, after this psychiatric hospital is built, Luis himself will become the first patient interned in that psychiatric hospital, thus becoming the first madman.
So he checks himself in.
I'm not sure if he checks himself in, but at the end of the novel it says that he
is the
actually
first patient.
becomes the first patient in this psychiatric hospital. So that's quite interesting. It's something that you just don't think about, but it's really well crafted. Right. Everything pretty much comes together at the end. And also at the very end it says, La vida del pobre demente fue breve y dulce sus postrimerías. So his life as a patient was short-lived, and the very end of his life was very sweet. The reason for that being that Luis, spent a lot of time just thinking of Bernice and saying things like, Bernice, Bernice of my soul, come back, come back. Run away from that ogre, meaning the New Yorker, and take refuge in my heart.
So he decides basically to live in a delusion, or he chooses to accept a false reality, and he has to go, whether he was taken there by choice, whether it was by choice or they took him there. He does choose that reality over the real world around him.
That's true, and because he does that, and he doesn't conform to the reality, he actually does not make himself compatible with the society around him. Then the society has to excise him from the society,
and he has
to put him into that psychiatric hospital that he actually helped build.
Right.
So there are many ideas that Rosalía is hinting at here. This is a short novel. It has probably about 150 pages or so. It's not a very long novel, but in a very little space, she's able to communicate a lot, and the way in which she does it is really crafty. It's really well done. It shows that she was a very thoughtful writer.
Right.
She planned this novel in that way.
Right.
She named it El Primer Loco for a reason.
Right.
And I just think it's one of those little gems from the 19th century that most people have never heard of.
Right.
It's very readable. The language for somebody who speaks Spanish will not be a problem.
Right.
And it's really a very interesting piece of literature that, as you mentioned before, does have very close ties with society and with the way society deals with certain anomalies within society. That is something that we're still talking about today.
It's relevant to our current situation and to the various things that people face day to day. So I think it's a great novel that you've presented for us, Anton.
Well, thank you. I really like it, and I encourage everyone out there who may be listening to us and can read in Spanish to look for it. You can do it for free if you have a Kindle.
Right.
And if not, it's fairly cheap to find, on Amazon or any of these online retailers. You'd be able to find a copy of The First Madman, or El Primer Loco, by Rosalía de Castro, published originally in the year of 1881, so about 130 some years ago.
Right, and yet these topics, these themes are still relevant today. So I think this is great. I'm glad that you've discussed our author Rosalía de Castro. Anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap it up for this podcast?
No, just the fact that, if you've been listening to these podcasts, you probably realize that one of the things that I am most interested in when it comes to novels, for example, also, when it comes to music, but, when it comes to novels, literature for sure, is to dig real deep into, the literary tradition,
right,
in this case of Spain, to find some novels that are really worth one's time, but that have been forgotten,
right,
that have been overlooked. And when I find one of those, I really take a big pleasure,
right,
out of just reading them, and in as many ways as I can, communicating that,
right,
to the world.
And I think our podcast, by and large, although with a few exceptions, we've had authors, or maybe some prominent authors, canonical authors, but the lesser known works. So I think that in that sense we have been, meeting that goal of sharing some of these works that are lesser known, more that our audience possibly can go out there and read and then share with their friends and family.
Well, we hope so, and this actually has been episode number 15, so
yes,
we hope to do as many as possible,
yes,
as long as we have the strength to do it,
exactly,
the health to do it, and as long as everyone out there
continues
still
to
listening
listen
to it. Yeah, that's for sure.
So I guess if you have any questions or comments, remember that you can email us at tracingtexts@gmail.com. That's tracingtexts@gmail.com. You can download the podcast via iTunes or Podomatic.
And it's also available on YouTube.
Yes, you always post it on YouTube.
You can stream it on YouTube.
Exactly. And I guess next time, I think I mentioned that I was going to talk about Ana Maria Moix, but we kind of changed the topic at some point, but I'm pretty sure that'll be my topic next time. So she is a Spanish writer, well known, but still I think she's worth, looking at I'm going to be looking at one of her novellas, so I'm looking forward to that.
Sounds like a very interesting one, and I know that both you and I have very busy summers for different reasons we won't go into, but I don't know, who knows, maybe at some point we can get together this summer and record it, and if not, we will do it when the new semester begins towards the end of August of this year, 2008. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for being here and listening to me and interacting with me talking about Rosalía de Castro. And to everyone out there, thank you very much for listening. And remember, as many comments as you can give us, as much feedback as we can get, we always really appreciate it.
That's right. So thank you so much for listening to
Tracing Texts.
And I guess goodbye.
Thank you so much. This has been episode 15 of Tracing Texts, coming to you live from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee. So long, everybody.
Goodbye.